Hello, this is a continuance of P.G. Wodehouse's Jeeves and the Feudal Spirit. And we're on to chapter 9. It was getting on for the quiet evenfall on the morrow when, after a pleasant drive through the smiling countryside, I steered the two-seater in at the gates of Brinkley Court and ankled along to inform my hostess that I had come aboard. I found her in a snuggery, or den, taking it easy with a cup of tea and an Agatha Christie. As I presented myself, she gave the moustache a swift glance, but, apart from starting like a nymph surprised while bathing, muttering something about was this the face that stopped at 1,000 clocks, made no comment. One received the impression that she was saving it up for later. "Hello, reptile," she said. "You're here, are you?" "Here I am," I responded, with my hair in a braid and wedded to the last button. "A very merry pip-pip to you, aged relative." "The same to you, fathead. I suppose you forgot to bring that necklace." "Far from it. Here it is." "It's the one Uncle Tom gave you at Christmas, isn't it?" "That's right. He likes to see me wearing it at dinner." "And who wouldn't?" I said courteously. I handed it over and helped myself to a slice of buttered toast. "Well, nice to be in the old home once more. I'm in my usual room, I take it. And how is everything in and around Brinkley Court? Anatole all right?" "Never better." "You look pretty roguish." "Oh, I'm fine." "And Uncle Tom?" A cloud passed over her shining evening face. "Tom's still a bit low, poor old buster." "Owing to Percy, you mean?" "That's right." "There has been no change, then, in this Gorringe's gloom?" "Naturally not. He's been worse than ever since Florence got here. Tom winces every time he sees him, especially at meals. He says that having to watch Percy push away untasted food cooked by Anatole gives him a rush of blood to the head, and that gives him indigestion. You know how sensitive his stomach is." I patted her hand. "Be of good cheer," I said. "I'll buck Perce up. Freddy Widgeon was showing me a twick with 2 corks and a bit of string the other night, which cannot fail to bring a smile to the most tortured face. It had the lads at the drones in stitches. You will doubtless be able to provide a couple of corks?" 20, if you wish." "Good." I took a cake with pink icing on it. "So much for Percy. What of the rest of the personnel? Anybody here besides the Twatter gang and Florence?" "Not yet. Tom said something about somebody named Lord Sidcup looking in for dinner tomorrow on his way to the brine baths at Droitwich. Do you know him?" "Never heard of him. He's a sealed book to me." "He's some man Tom met in London. Apparently he's a bit of a nib on old silver, and Tom wants to show him his collection." I nodded. I knew this uncle to be greatly addicted to the collecting of old silver. His apartments, both at Brinkley Court and at his house in Charles Street, are full of things I wouldn't be seen dead in a ditch with. "What they call a virtuoso, this Lord Sidcup would be, I presume?" "Something along those lines." "Ah, well, it takes all sorts to make a world, does it not?" "We shall also have with us tomorrow the Bythorn Cheesewright, and the day after that Daphne Dolores Moorhead. She's the novelist." "I know. Florence was telling me about her. You bought a cereal from her, I understand." "Yes. I thought it would be a shrewd move to salt the mine." I didn't get this. She seemed to me an aunt who was talking in riddles. How do you mean, salt the mine? What mine? This is the first I've heard of any mines. I think that if her mouth had not been full of buttered toast, she would have clicked her tongue, for as soon as she had cleared the gangway with a quick swallow, she spoke impatiently, as if my slowness in the uptake had exasperated her. You really are an abysmal ass, young Bertie. Haven't you ever heard of salting mines? It's a recognised business precaution. When you've got a dud mine you want to sell to a mug, you sprinkle an ounce or two of gold over it and summon the mug to come on and inspect the property. He walls up, sees the gold, feels that this is what the doctor orders and reaches for his checkbook. I worked on the same principle. I was still at a loss and said so, and this time she did click her tongue. Can't you grasp it, chump? I brought the cereal to make the paper look good to Trotter. He sees the announcement that a Daphne Moorhead opus is coming along and is terrifically impressed. Gosh, he says to himself, Daphne Dolores Moorhead and everything. The lady's boudoir must be hot stuff. But don't these blokes want to see books and figures and the things before they brass up? Not if they've been having Anatole's cooking for a week or more. That's why I asked him down here. I saw what she meant, and her reasoning struck me as sound. There is something about those lunches and dinners of Anatole's that mellows you and saps your cool judgment. After tucking into them all this time, I presumed that L.G. Twotter was going about in a sort of rosy mist, wanting to do kind acts right and left like a Boy Scout, continue the treatment for a few more days, and he would probably beg her as a personal favour to accept twice what she was asking. Very shrewd, I said. Yes, I think you're on the right lines. Has Anatole been giving you his Ronalds or Montans? And he sold you all lattues à la grecque. Then I would say the thing was in the bag. All over but the chewing. But here's a point that's been puzzling me, I said. Florence tells me that La Moorhead is one of the more costly of our female pen pushers and has to have purses of gold flung to her in great profusion before she will consent to sign on the dotted line. Correct? Quite correct. Then how the dickens, I said, getting down to it in my keen way, did you contrive to extract the necessary ore from Uncle Tom? Didn't he pay his income tax this year? You bet he did. I should have thought you would have heard his screams in London. Poor old boy, how he does suffer on these occasions. She spoke sooth. Uncle Tom, though abundantly provided with the chips, having been until his retirement one of those merchant princes who scoop it up in sackfuls out east, has a rooted objection to letting the hellhounds of the inland revenue dip in and get theirs. For weeks after they have separated him from his hard-earned, he is inclined to go off into corners and sit with his head between his hands, muttering about ruin and a sinister trend of socialistic legislation. What is to become of us all if this continues? He certainly does, I assented. Quite the soul in torment, what? And yet, despite this, you succeeded in nicking him for what must have been a small fortune. How did you do it? From what you were saying on the phone last night, I got the impression that he was in more than usually non-parting mood these days. You conjured up in my mind's eye the picture of a man who was sticking his ears back and refusing to play ball like Balaam's ass. What do you know about Balaam's ass? Me? I know Balaam's ass from soup to nuts. Have you forgotten that Winnapoople at the Reverend Aubrey Upjohn's educational establishment at Wamley-on-Sea, I once won a prize for scripture knowledge? I'll bet you cribbed. Not at all. My triumph was due to sheer merit. But, getting back to it, how did you induce Uncle Tom to scare the moths from his pocketbook? It must have required quite a scuttleful of wifely wiles on your part. I wouldn't like to say of a loved aunt that she giggled, but unquestionably the sound that proceeded from her lips closely resembled a giggle.
Oh, I managed.
But how? Never mind how, you pestilential young nosy Parker. I managed. I see, I said, letting it go. Something told me she did not wish to spill the data. And how is the twatter deal coming along? I seemed to have touched an exposed nerve. The giggle died on her lips, and her face, always, as I have said, on the wedgish side, deepened in colour to a rich mauve. Blister his blighted insides, she said, speaking with the explosive heat which had once made fellow members of the Quorn and Pitchley leap convulsively in their saddles. I don't know what's the matter with the son of Belial. Here he is, with 9 of Anatole's lunches and 8 of Anatole's dinners tucked away among the gastric juices, and he refuses to get down to brass tacks. He hums. What on earth does he do that for? And whores. He evades the issue. I strain every nerve to make him talk turkey, but I can't pin him down. He doesn't say yes and he doesn't say no. There's a song called that. Or rather, she didn't say yes and she didn't say no. I sing it a good deal in my path. It goes like this. I started to render the refrain in a pleasant light baritone, but desisted on receiving Agatha Christie abaft the frontal bone. The old relative seemed to have fired from the hip like somebody in a Western V picture.
Don't try me too high, Bertie dear,
she said gently, and fell into what looked like a reverie.
Do you know what I think is the trouble? She went on, coming out of it. I believe Ma Trotter is responsible for this non-cooperation of his. For some reason she doesn't want him to put the deal through, and has told him he mustn't. It's the only explanation I can think of. When I met him at Agatha's, he spoke as if he were just a matter of arranging terms. But these last few days he's come over all coy, as if acting under orders from up top. When you stood them dinner that night, did he strike you as being crushed beneath her heel? Very much so. He wept with delight when she gave him a smile, and trembled with fear at her frown. But why would she object to him buying the boudoir? Don't ask me. It's a complete mystery. You haven't put her back up somehow since she got here? Certainly not. I've been fascinating. And yet, there it is. What? Exactly. There it blasted well is. Curse it. I heaved a sympathetic sigh. Mine is a tender heart easily wrung, and this spectacle of this good old egg mourning over what might have been had wrung it like a ton of bricks. Too bad, I said. One had hoped for better things. One had, she assented. I was so sure that Moorhead cereal would have brought home the bacon. Of course, he may just be thinking it over. That's true. A fellow thinking it over would naturally hum. And haw. And possibly also haw. You could scarcely expect him to do less. We would no doubt have proceeded to go more deeply into the matter, subjecting this humming and hawing of L.G. Twatters to a close analysis. But at this moment the door opened, and a careworn face peered in, a face disfigured on either side by short whiskers, and in the middle by tortoiseshell-rimmed spectacles. I say,
said the face, contorted with anguish.
Have you seen Florence?
Aunt Daly replied that she had not been privileged to do so since lunch.
I thought she might be with you.
She isn't,
Oh,
said the face, still running the gamut of the emotions, and began to recede. Hey! Cried Aunt Dahlia, arresting it as it was about to disappear. She went to the desk and picked up a buff envelope. This telegram came for her just now. Will you give it to her if you see her? And while you're here, meet my nephew Bertie Wooster, the pride of Piccadilly.
Well, I hadn't expected him, on learning of my identity, to dance around the room on the tips of his toes, and he didn't. He gave me a long, reproachful look, similar in its essentials to that which a black beetle gives a cook when the latter is sprinkling insect powder on it.
I have corresponded with Mr. Rooster,
he said coldly.
We have also spoken on the telephone.
He turned and was gone, gazing at me reproachfully to the last. It was plain that the Gorringes did not lightly forget.
That was Percy,
said Aunt Dahlia. I replied that I had divined as much.
Did you notice how he looked when he said Florence? Like a dying duck in a thunderstorm.
And did you notice, I inquired in my turn, how he looked when you said Bertie Wooster? Like someone finding a dead mouse in his pint of beer. Not a bonhomous bird, not my type.
No! You would scarcely suppose that even a mother could view him without nausea, would you? And yet he is the apple of Ma Trotter's eyes. She loves him as much as she hates Mrs. Alderman Blenkinsop. Did she touch on Mrs. Alderman Blenkinsop at that dinner of yours?
At several points during the meal. Who is she?
Her bitterest social rival up in Liverpool.
Do they have social rivals up in Liverpool?
You bet they do, in droves. I gather that it is nip and tuck between the Trotter and the Blenkinsop as to who shall be the uncrowned queen of Liverpudlian society. Sometimes one gets her nose in front, sometimes the other. It's like what one used to read about, the death struggles for supremacy in New York's 400 in the old days. But why am I telling you all this? You ought to be out there in the sunset racing after Percy and backing him up with your off-colour stories. You have a fund of off-colour stories, I presume?
Oh, rather.
Then get going, laddie. Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more. Or close up the wall with our English dead. Yikes! Tally-ho! Hark forward!
She added, reverting to the argot of the hunting field. Well, when Aunt Dahlia tells you to get going, you get going if you know what's good for you. But I was in no cheery mood as I made my way into the great open spaces. That look of Percy's had told me that he was going to be a hard audience. It had had in it much of the austerity which I had noticed in Stilton Cheesewhite's Uncle Joseph during our get-together at Vinton Street Police Court. It was with not a little satisfaction, accordingly, that I found on arriving in the open no signs of him. Relieved, I abandoned the chase and started to stroll hither and thither, taking the air, and I hadn't taken much of it when there he was, rounding a rhododendron bush in my very path. Chapter 10. If it hadn't been for the whiskers, I don't believe I would have recognised him. It was only about 10 minutes since he had shoved his face in at the door of Aunt Dahlia's lair, but in that brief interval his whole aspect had changed. No longer the downcast duck in a thunderstorm from whom I had so recently parted, he had become gay and bobbish. His air was jaunty, his smile bright, and there was in his demeanour more than a suggestion of a man who might at any moment break into a tap dance. It was as if he had spent a considerable time watching that twick of Freddie Wiggins with the 2 corks and the bit of string.
Hello there, Wooster,
he cried buoyantly, and you would have supposed that finding Bertram in the mists
had just about made his day.
Taking a stroll, eh?
I said yes, I was taking a stroll, and he beamed as though feeling that I would have pursued no wiser and more admirable course.
Sensible chap, Wooster.
He seemed to be saying.
He takes strolls.
There was a short intermission here, during which he looked at me lovingly and slid his feet about a bit in the manner of one trying out a dance steps. Then he said it was a beautiful evening, and I endorsed this.
The sunset.
He said, indicating it. Very pretty, I agreed, for the whole horizon was aflame with glorious technicolor.
Seeing it,
He said.
I am reminded of a poem I wrote the other day for
Parnassus.
just a little thing I dashed off. You might care to hear it.
Oh, rather.
It's called Caliban at Sunset.
What at sunset?
Caliban.
He cleared his throat and began.
I stood with a man watching the sun go down. The air was full of murmurous summer scents, and a brave breeze sang like a bugle from a sky that smouldered in the west, a sky of crimson, amethyst, and gold, and sepia, and blue as were the eyes of Helen, when she sat gazing from some high tower in Ilium upon the Grecian tents darkling below. And he, this man who stood besides me, gaped like some dull, half-witted animal, and said, I say, doesn't that sunset remind you of a slice of underdone roast beef?
He opened his eyes, which he had closed in order to render the morceau more effectively.
Bitter, of course.
Oh, frightfully bitter.
I was feeling bitter when I wrote it. I think you know a man named Jeeves, right? It was he I had in mind. Actually, we never stood watching a sunset together, but I felt it was just the sort of thing he would have said if he had been watching a sunset. If you see what I mean, am I right?
Quite right.
A soulless clod, don't you think?
Soulless to the core.
No finer feelings.
None.
Would I be correct in describing him as a pumpkin-headed oaf?
Quite correct,
Yes.
he said.
She is well out of it.
She?
Florence.
Oh, well, out of what? He eyed me speculatively, heaving gently like a saucepan of porridge about to reach the height of its fever. I am a man who can observe and deduce, and it was plain to me, watching him sizzle, that something had happened pretty recently in his affairs which had churned him up like a seidlitz power, leaving him with but two alternatives. A, to burst where he stood, and B, to decant his pent-up emotion on the first human being who came along. No doubt he would have preferred this human being to be of a non-Wooster nature, but one imagines that he was saying to himself that you can't have everything, and that he was in no position to pick and choose. He decided on alternative B.
Wooster,
He said, placing a hand on my shoulder.
may I ask you a question? Has your aunt told you that I love Florence Cray?
Yes, she did mention it, yes.
I thought she might have done. She is not what I would call a reticent woman, though of course with many excellent qualities. I was forced to take her into my confidence soon after arrival here, because she asked me why the devil I was going about looking like a dead codfish.
Or like Hamlet.
Hamlet, or a dead codfish. The point is immaterial. I confessed to her that it was because I loved Florence with a consuming passion and had discovered that she was engaged to the oaf Cheesewright. It had been, I explained, as if I had received a crushing blow on the head.
Like Sir Eustace Willoughby.
I beg your pardon?
In The Mystery of the Pink Crayfish, he was conked on the bean in the library one night, and if you ask me, it was the butler who did it. But I interrupted you.
You did?
I'm sorry, you were saying it was as if you had received a crushing blow on the head.
Exactly. I reeled beneath the shock.
Must have been a nasty jar.
It was. I was stunned. But now, you remember that telegram your aunt gave me to give to Florence?
Yes, the telegram.
It was from Cheesewright, breaking the engagement.
I had no means of knowing, of course, what his form was when reeling beneath shocks, but I doubted whether he could have put up a performance topping mine as I heard these words. The sunset swayed before my eyes as if it were doing the shimmy, and a bird close by, which was getting outside its evening worm, looking for an instant like two birds, both flickering. What? I gurgled, rocking on my base.
Yes.
He's broken the engagement?
Precisely.
Oh, golly. Why? He shook his head.
Ah, that I couldn't tell you. All I know is that I found Florence in the stable yard, tickling a cat behind the ear, and I came up and said, "Here's a telegram for you." And she said, "Really? I suppose it's from Darcy." I shuddered at the name, and while I was shuddering, she opened the envelope. It was a long telegram, but she had not read more than the first words when she uttered a sharp cry. "Bad news?" I queried. Her eyes flashed and a cold, proud look came into her face. "Not at all," she replied. "Splendid news. Darcy Cheesewright has broken the engagement."
Gosh.
You may well say gosh.
She didn't tell you any more than that?
No, she said one or two incisive things about Cheesewright, with which I thoroughly concurred, and strode off in the direction of the kitchen garden. And I came away walking, as you may well imagine, on air. I deprecate the modern tendency to use slang, but I am not ashamed to confess that what I was saying to myself was the word whoopee. Excuse me, Rooster, I must leave you now. I can't keep still.
And with these words he pranced off like a mustang, leaving me to face the changed conditions alone. It was with a brooding sense of peril that I did so. And if you are saying, "But why, Wooster? Surely everything is pretty smooth. What matter if the girl's nuptials with Cheesewright have been cancelled? When here is Percy Gorringe, all ready and eager to take up the white man's burden." I reply, but you've not seen Percy Gorringe. I mean to say, I couldn't picture Florence, however much on the rebound, accepting the addresses of a man who voluntarily wore side whiskers and wrote poems about sunsets. Far more likely it seemed to me that, having a vacant date on her hands, she would once again reach out for the old and tried, viz. Poor old Bertram. It was what she had done before, and these things tend to become a habit. I was completely at a loss to imagine what could have caused this in and out running on Stilton's part. The thing didn't make sense. When last seen, it will be remembered, he had had all the earmarks of one about whom love had twined its silken fetters. His every word at that parting chat of ours had indicated this beyond peradventure and doubt. Dash it, I mean, you don't go telling people you will break their spines in 4 places if they come oiling around the adored object, unless you have more than a passing fancy for that bally girl. So, what had occurred to dim the lamp of love and all that sort of thing? Could it be, I asked myself, that the strain of growing that moustache had proved too much for him? Had he caught sight of himself in the mirror about the 3rd day? The 3rd day is always the danger point. And felt that nothing in the way of wedded bliss could make the venture worthwhile? Called upon to choose between the woman he loved and a hairless upper lip, had he quacked, with the result that the lip had had it by a landslide? With a view to getting the inside stuff straight from the horse's mouth, I hurried to the kitchen garden where, if Percy was to be relied on, Florence would now be, probably pacing up and down with lowered head. She was there, with lowered head, though not actually pacing up and down. She was bending over a gooseberry bush, eating gooseberries in an overwrought sort of a way. Seeing me, she straightened up, and I snapped into the res without preamble. "What's all this I hear from Percy Gorringe?" I said. She swallowed a gooseberry with a passionate gulp that spoke eloquently of the churned-up soul, and I saw, as Percy's words had led me to expect, that she was madder than a wet hen. Her whole aspect was that of a girl who would have given her year's dress allowance for the privilege of beating G. Darcy Cheesewhite over the head with a parasol. I continued. "He says there's been a rift within the lute."
I beg your pardon."
"You and Stilton. According to Percy, the lute is not the lute it was. Stilton has broken the engagement, he tells me."
"He has. I'm delighted, of course."
"Delighted? You like the setup?"
"Of course I do. What girl would not be delighted who finds herself unexpectedly free from a man with a pink face and a head that looks as if it has been blown up with a bicycle pump?"
I clutched the brow. I'm a pretty astute chap, and I could see that this was not the language of love. I mean, if you had heard Juliet saying a thing like that about Romeo, you would have raised the eyebrows in quick concern, wondering if all was well with the young couple. But when I saw him last, everything seemed perfectly okie-dokie. I could have sworn that, however reluctantly, he had reconciled himself to growing that moustache. She stooped and took another gooseberry.
"It has nothing to do with moustaches,"
she said, reappearing on the surface.
"The whole thing is due to the fact that Darcy Cheesewhite is a low, mean, creeping, crawling, slinking, spying, despicable worm."
She proceeded, dishing out the words from between clenched teeth.
"Do you know what he did?"
"I haven't a notion." She refreshed herself with a further gooseberry and returned to the upper air, breathing a few puffs of flame through the nostrils.
"He sneaked around to that club yesterday and made enquiries."
"Oh my gosh."
"Yes, you wouldn't think a man could stoop so low, but he bribed people and was allowed to look at the head waiter's book and found that a table had been reserved that night in your name. This confirmed his degraded suspicions. He knew that I had been there with you."
"I suppose," said Florence, diving at the gooseberry bush once more and starting to strip it of its contents,
"a man gets a rotten spying mind like that from being a policeman."
To say that I was appalled would not be putting it any too strongly. I was, moreover, astounded. It was a revelation to me that a puff-faced poop like Stilton could have been capable of detective work on this uncanny scale. I had always respected his physique, of course, but had supposed that the ability to Felanox with a single blow more or less let him out. Not for an instant had I credited him with the reasoning powers that might well have made Hercule Poirot himself draw the breath in with a startled "What ho!" It just showed how one ought never to underestimate a man simply because he devotes his life to shoving oars into rivers and pulling them out again. He's being about as silly a way of passing the time as could be hit upon. No doubt, as Florence had said, this totally unforeseen snakiness was the result of his having been, if only briefly, a member of the police force. One presumes that when the neophyte had been issued his uniform and regulation boots, the men up top take him aside and teach him a few things likely to be of use to him in his chosen profession. Stilton, it was plain, had learnt his lesson well, and, if one did but know, was probably capable of measuring bloodstains and collecting cigar ash. However, it was only a fleeting attention that I gave to this facet of the situation. My thoughts were concentrated on something of far greater pith and moment, as Jeeves would say. I allude to the position, now that the man knew all, of B. Wooster, which seemed to me sticky to a degree. Florence, having sated herself with gooseberries, was starting to move off, and I arrested her with a sharp "Oi!" "That telegram," I said.
I don't want to talk about it.
"I do. Was there anything about me in it?"
Oh, yes, quite a lot.
I swallowed a couple of times and passed a finger round the inside of my collar. I had thought there might be. "Did he hint at any plans he had with regards to me?"
He said he was going to break your spine in 5 places.
5 places?
I think he said 5. Don't you let him,
said Florence warmly, and it was nice, of course, to know that she disapproved.
Breaking spines, I never heard of such a thing. He ought to be ashamed of himself.
And she moved off in the direction of the house, walking like a tragedy queen on one of her bad mornings. What I have heard Jeeves call the glimmering landscape was now fading on at the sight, and it was getting on for the hour when dressing gongs are beaten. But though I knew how rush it is ever to be late for one of Anatole's dinners, I could not bring myself to go in and don the soup and fish. I had so much to occupy the mind that I lingered on in a sort of stupor. Winged creatures of the night kept rolling up and taking a look at me and rolling off again. But I remained motionless, plunged in thought. A man pursued by a thug like Darcy Cheesewhite has need of all the thought he can get hold of. And then, quite suddenly, out of the night that covered me, black as a pit from pole to pole, there shone a gleam of light. It spread, illuminating the entire horizon, and I realised that, taken by and large, I was sitting pretty. You see, what I had failed till now to spot was the fact that Stilton hadn't a notion that I was at Winkley. Thinking me to be in the metropolis, it was there that he would be spreading his dragnet. He would call at the flat, ring bells, get no answer, and withdraw baffled. He would haunt the drones, expecting me to drop in, and eventually, when I didn't so drop, he would slink away, baffled again. "He cometh not," he would say, no doubt grinding his teeth in a fat lot of good that would do him. And of course, after what had occurred, there was no chance of him visiting Winkley. A man who has broken off his engagement doesn't go to the country house where he knows the girl to be. Well, I mean, I ask you, naturally he doesn't. If there was one spot on earth which could be counted on as of even date to be wholly free from Cheesewhites, it was Brinkley Court, Brinkley cum Snodsfield in the Marsh, Worcestershire. Profoundly relieved, I picked up the feet and hastened to my room with a song on my lips. Jeeves was there, not actually holding a stopwatch, but obviously shaking his head a bit over the young master's tardiness. His left eyebrow quivered perceptibly as I entered. "Yes, I know I'm late, Jeeves.
I said, starting to shed the upholstery. I went for a stroll. He accepted the explanation indulgently.
I quite understand, sir. It had occurred to me that, the evening being so fine, you were probably enjoying a saunter in the grounds. I told Mr. Cheesewright that this was no doubt the reason for your absence.